Well, good morning, beloved. We're going to pick back up in Daniel this morning, chapter 8. And we're going to read the first 3 verses. So here we go. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up my eyes, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Now, Daniel is going back in time to describe a vision that he saw in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign as king of Babylon. Remember, Belshazzar was given the handwriting on the wall with the finger of God in chapter 5 and was conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire that very night. The ram with 2 horns that were high represents 2 kingdoms of great power. Of the 2 kingdoms, the greater came to power after the first one and became even a greater power than the first one. And this is speaking, of course, of the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes, who were the Assyrians, were at first the great power. But then the Persian Empire came along and pretty much assimilated the Median kingdom into itself and eventually became known as just the Persian Empire. We know this from history and from the interpretation given in verse 20 of this chapter, which says, "The ram which thou saw having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia." Now let's look at verse 4. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great. Now on the west, the conquest embraced Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor. On the north, Colchis, Armenia, Iberia, and the regions around the Caspian Sea. And on the south, Palestine, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Libya. Now, isn't it awesome that Daniel knew the Medes and the Persians were coming before they ever came? How would this affect him when it happened? Well, I believe it would greatly strengthen his faith and his hope when God's prophetic word came to pass just as he said it would. And God's faithfulness to his word grows our faith and our hope and our love for him. Amen? Amen. So now let's look at verses 5 through 7. And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns. Now we know this is the Medo-Persian Empire, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Now, who was this male goat and this notable horn between his eyes? Well, the male goat with the notable horn between its eyes represented Greece, and even more specifically Alexander the Great. And this is confirmed by history and by verse 21 of Daniel, where we read the rough shaggy goat, that's what rough means, is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes, the first king. Now Albert Barnes makes this comment, quote, The power represented is that of Greece when it was consolidated under Alexander the Great, and when he went forth to subjugation of this vast Persian empire. The symbol of a goat is often found in various ways in connection with Macedonia, and the goat was used as an emblem of that power. Now, John Gill makes comments on this, quote, "It is remarkable that the arms of Macedonia, or the ensigns, which means flags, carried before their armies were a goat," picture of a goat on them, "ever since the days of Caranus, who following a flock of goats was directed to Edessa, a city of Macedonia, and took it. And from this circumstance of the goats, called it Aegeus, and the people Aegeades, which signifies goats, and put the goat in his arms." Now, the phrase that we read, "touching not the ground," speaking of this goat with the notable horn, this speaks to the swiftness of Alexander the Great's conquests. He conquered his main enemies and established one of the ancient world's largest empires in only 13 years. He campaigned constantly from his ascension in 336 BC to his death at age 32 in 323 BC after a 13-day illness. He defeated the Persian army in about 5 to 8 years before campaigning in India, never losing a battle. There's many theories that surround the illness that took his life, one of which is that some of his troops, being worn out, had had enough and poisoned him because of his relentless, constant marching and fighting with hardly any rests. So let's look at verse 8 of Daniel chapter 8. "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven." When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his 4 primary generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors. Now, this division didn't come about peacefully. There was a lot of civil war between them, but it finally played out in the end to where there was 4 generals that came out of the army of Alexander. The first, Ptolemy the First Soter, he took control of Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty. That would have been the kingdom towards the south. Then Seleucus the First Nicator, he founded the Seleucid Empire, which consisted of a large portion of the former Persian Empire, and his would have been towards the north and towards the east. Cassander took control of Macedonia and Greece, and he eliminated Alexander's family in order to secure his reign. Now that would have been back towards the west, towards Greece and Macedonia, Cassander. And then finally, Lysimachus took control of Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Okay? So, initially, Antiochus I, Monophthalmus, held a large portion of Asia, but was defeated at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, and the empire solidified around the 4 main successors that I just mentioned. Alexander the Great and his 4 successors were depicted as a leopard with 4 wings in Daniel 7:6. "After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of its 4 wings, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." So we see, even back in chapter 7, there was another vision that Daniel had, and it was still speaking of this Greek empire being divided into 4 separate kingdoms. And again, Alexander and his 4 successors are depicted in Daniel 11, verses 3 through 4. When we get there, we'll talk about it again. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, north, east, south, and west, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. Okay? So we see that history bears this out, and Daniel didn't see any of this, but it was prophesied, and the children of Israel had this prophecy in their hand, and it's going to be important later when we get to it. Verse 9 of Daniel chapter 8. And out of one of them, out of one of the four generals, came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land, which would be the area of Judah. Excuse me. Now, this little horn that sprang up out of one of the four, not among the four, as the little horn of Daniel 7:8, but he sprang up out of one of the four. Historically, there is no doubt that this little horn is speaking of Antiochus Epiphanies, son of Antiochus the king, who sprung up from the Seleucid Empire in Syria. And if you remember, Seleucus the first Nicator founded the Seleucid Empire, and it was to the north. Okay? Alright. We learn a lot about him from the book of Maccabees. He had been a hostage in Rome, but he escaped by stealth, and he seized the kingdom of Syria, which belonged to his elder brother's son. He obtained it through deceitful methods, but he had no right to it, nor any of the qualities of royalty for it. 1 Maccabees 1:10. Now, if you're curious, where's 1 Maccabees, is some of the intertestamental books that were written between the Old Testament and the New Testament, called the Apocrypha. And the book of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, gives us a lot of history that occurred between the closing of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the beginning of the New Testament, Matthew. Okay, there had been approximately 400 years where God had been silent and had spoken through no prophets until John the Baptist came along. But anyway, one of these historical documents that's found within the Apocrypha, the intertestamental writings, and they're not sacred writings, but that doesn't mean the history in it is not true. But in 1 Maccabees 1, chapter 1, verse 10, it says of him, of Antiochus, there came out of them a wicked root surnamed Epiphanes. Okay? Antiochus surnamed Epiphanes. Now, it says waxed exceedingly great towards the south. Now, Egypt lay south of Syria, and Antiochus went there and fought against Ptolemy Philometor, who was the king of Egypt at the time, and he took many cities, and he besieged Alexandria. He probably would have taken the whole country, but the Romans restrained him by sending an ambassador named Popilius to him, telling him to cease and desist upon threat of Rome. Now in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 17 through 20, it relates the following about this campaign where Antiochus came south. It says, quote, he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots and elephants and horsemen, and a great navy. And he made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. Plus Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. An army needs to eat and be supplied, and he took all the spoils that he could get out of Egypt. And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude. Then notice it said he went toward the east. He then went east towards Armenia and Persia and Media, and the countries beyond the Euphrates, whom he made tributary to him. In other words, he calls them to have to pay him taxes and such. Maccabees chapter 3, verse 31, relates the following concerning this campaign. Wherefore, being greatly perplexed in his mind, he determined to go into Persia, there to take the tributes of the countries and to gather much money. Then Maccabees 6, 1 through 2 gives us a little more info on this campaign. Quote, about that time King Antiochus, traveling through the high countries, heard said that Elymais in the country of Persia was a city greatly renowned for riches and silver and gold. Again, an army has to eat, be fed, clothed, and all of that. And breastplates and shields, which Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian king, who reigned first among the Grecians, had left there. So he went towards the east, and he went to this city to get more supplies, more things that he could trade and sell so that he could continue his conquests. And then it says that he went towards the pleasant land. Now this, I believe, was in reference to the land of Judah, because of its beautiful lands and its great fruitfulness, and because God chose it above all others for his habitation. This is the land where his word and worship were observed and enjoyed. It was the land where Messiah was to be born. Antiochus greatly afflicted and distressed the Jewish land with his army, and made himself master of most of the places in Judea and Galilee. The Arabic version of Scriptures translates this portion as toward the west instead of towards the pleasant land. That's because he had already gone east towards that city Elymais to get the gold over in Persia, and now he came back towards the west or towards the pleasant land. No mention is made of the north because that's where he was from, Syria. Antiochus' home was there, and later on we'll read that the king of the north, remember this now, the king of the north, later on in the book of Daniel, it refers to the king of the north, and is speaking of Antiochus, and it speaks of the king of the south, which refers to the king of Egypt. Okay, so king of the north was the king of Syria, which was Antiochus, and the king of the south was the king of Egypt, which was in the south. But here's something I want to share with you that Calvin shared, that I believe he saw through a lot of this. And I don't agree with everything Calvin says, but I think he hit the nail on the head with this aspect. Listen to what he says, because I love it. Quote, it was of very great importance to warn the Jews of the calamities which were about to oppress them. There is nothing which causes more torments of the mind of men than their becoming bewildered in false imaginations and thinking that everything in the world is by chance, while they never ponder over the providence of God, nor reflect upon his judgments. Hence, with this design, God wished to teach the prophet and all the pious the nature of their future afflictions, since they would thus understand how events never happened by chance. Beloved, there's no such thing as chance, because God is sovereign. And if you believe in chance, then you do not believe in the sovereignty of God, plain and simple. But Calvin continues, he says, but all these scourges proceeded from God. For the same God both determines and executes his decrees, just as he also predicts future events. For if nothing had been predicted, the godly would have glided gently downward into despair in consequence of their heavy afflictions. The Jews were permitted to return to their own land, but we know how cruelly they were harassed by all their neighbors, so that they did not dwell in that corner of the world without the greatest difficulty. The building of both the city and the temple was hindered by many enemies, till at length they became tributary to the kings of Syria. Antiochus, indeed, who is here alluded to, advanced with cruel tyranny against the people of God. If this had not been predicted, they would have thought themselves deceived by the splendid promises concerning their return. But when they perceived everything occurring according as they had been forewarned, this became no slight solace in the midst of their woes. Do you hear what Calvin is saying? Because God left them this prophecy in Daniel, when the things came to pass and they saw it in God's Word, it comforted them, gave them great comfort and encouragement and strength to be able to endure, knowing that God said this was going to happen and God's in control of this. Okay? That's what Calvin is getting at. They could then determine at once how completely it was in the power of God to relieve them from so many and such oppressive evils. Now here's Calvin's summary. With that intention, then, had God predicted all these things to his prophet Daniel? Okay, that's the intention. What is the intention, he asked, that God predicted all these things to the prophet Daniel? Clearly, that the Jews might look forward to a happy result and not give way to despair under events so full of anxiety and confusion. This then was the purpose of the prophecy with reference to that particular period. End of Calvin's quote. Okay. So whereas the historical information given concerning Daniel 8:9 is important, it's much more important that we understand the purpose behind the prophecy of Daniel 8:9. Our God is a God of compassion. And even when he has to use the rod of correction on his children, he still gives them hope in the midst of it by many means. Prophecy and promises are two of those means of hope that we can hold on to in times of darkness and trial. Well, look at verse 10. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. The it, of course, being the little horn Antiochus Epiphanies. Antiochus was driven by the spirit of Satan, who when he was Lucifer, stated in Isaiah 14:13, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. Everyone who walks in pride walks in the spirit of Satan. Some believe that the host of heaven and the stars spoken of in this verse represents the priests and the Levites and the worshipers of the one true God. Okay? Listen to what Albert Barnes says. It is the design here to describe the pride and ambition of Antiochus, and to show that he did not think anything too exalted for his aspiration. None were too high or too scared to be secure from his attempts to overthrow them. And even those who by their position and character spoken of as, quote, suns and stars to the ground, were cast to the ground. So here you see he's speaking about, Barnes believes it's speaking about the religious leaders of Israel is who he was referring to when it says, when he says it waxed great even to the host of heaven. Now, 1st and 2nd Maccabees describe the fierceness and the brutalness of Antiochus' treatment of the Jews. In chapter 7 of 2nd Maccabees, I was going to read it, but it's pretty lengthy. I'm just going to give you an overview. But in chapter 7 of 2nd Maccabees, there's an account of a godly mother with 7 sons, all of which were brutally, one by one, mutilated and killed before her eyes, in an attempt to get them to eat pork, which was forbidden for Jews. All her sons refused in spite of the terrible treatment, and finally the mother was killed also. And that's most of what 2 Maccabees chapter 7 of 2 Maccabees relates to us, that story. Antiochus was brutal, and especially toward the Jews. He wanted to turn them away from the one true God and over unto idols and to the Greek gods of Zeus and all those on Olympus and everything. Calvin notes, the horn became magnificent and waxed great, even to the army or host of the heavens. And he says, without the slightest of doubt, this figure marks the elect people of God. Our seat is laid up in heaven, and God numbers us among the stars. God here shows his prophet, as in a mirror, the estimation in which he holds his church, however contemptible it is on earth. That horn then was magnified before the army of the heavens, and cast down some of that army upon the earth, and trod them out of the stars, permitting him to treat the church with contempt, to tread it underfoot. Now John Gill, concerning it waxed great even to the host of heaven. The people of the Jews, the army of the living God, the church militant, among whom were many of the citizens of heaven, whose names were written there, such was the insolence of this king as to molest and to disturb them. And it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. The stars being the lights of the people, the priests and the Levites that ministered to them, or the princes and elders of the people, whom he slew, or removed from their posts so that they could not do their office. Now, all of these people had basically the same view, where it says it waxed great even to the host of heaven. Okay? Now I want to give you a couple of different views of a couple of men that you probably know that are premillennials, but with different views. Okay? The first I'm going to begin with is Dr. Henry Morris, a very godly man who's gone home to be with the Lord, who stood in the gap against the evolutionary false lies and teachings and founded the Institute for Creation Research. But he says concerning the little horn, quote, "This little horn is evidently the same as the little horn of Daniel 7:8, the beast of the end times, also known as the Antichrist. He cannot be, as some expositors believe, Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Syrian kings in the dynasty established by Seleucus. Although he did manifest the character of an Antichrist, Antiochus did not become as great as, quote, the host of heaven. Nor do the other things described in Daniel 8:10 through 14 and Daniel 8:22 through 25. When Gabriel interpreted the vision to Daniel, he said specifically that it was the time of the end. Verse 17. This person said specifically to come forth out of one of the four divisions of Alexander's empire must be possessed and energized by Satan himself, for in no other way could he be said to wax as great as the host of heaven, a term used throughout the Bible only for either stars or angels or both. In the New Testament, he is called that man of sin, the son of perdition, 2 Thessalonians 2:3. And it is clear that when men worship him as he demands, they actually are worshiping Satan, Revelation 13:4. Now that's the end of the quote by Dr. Henry Morris. Now, I kind of disagree with him about the little horn of Daniel 7:8 because that horn is plainly part of the fourth beast of Rome. Okay? Listen to what John MacArthur, the late John MacArthur, said about this host of heaven, where it says that he exalted himself or waxed great even to the host of heaven. This picturesque language portrays Antiochus's persecution against Jewish people using the figure of stars. When defeated, the stars or Jewish people will fall under the tyrant's dominion. the time of the end, verse 8 or 17 of chapter 8, this term likely has a double sense of fulfillment. Okay, now let me explain that, what he's talking about, a double sense of fulfillment. He's talking about a near and a far fulfillment. He says, first, the end, as verse 19 states, latter time, verses 19 and 23, appointed time, verse 19, refer to time late in the specific span that the historical prophecy has in view. That time is the period defined by the empires in these verses, Persia, the ram, Greece, the goat, when the Grecian sector will be divided into 4 parts, verse 8. One of these, the Syrian under Seleucus, will eventually lead to Antiochus Epiphanies, 175 to 164 BC, as the little horn meant in verse 9, who persecutes the people of Israel, verse 10, and defies God. Now, what John MacArthur's saying here, that's the first or near fulfillment of this prophecy. But then he goes on and he says, secondly, this little horn in verse 9, the Antichrist in the last days at the time of the eschatological fulfillment, sees Antiochus as a pattern of the Antichrist, who in many ways will be like him, though far greater in power, and will exercise his career in the end of the age, just before Christ's return. Now that's the end of John MacArthur's quote. Both of these men were premillennials and very godly and very highly educated, both with doctorate degrees, and both godly men who loved the Lord. But even those two who were premillennials had differing views. Dr. Henry Morris didn't allow for a near far. He said it wasn't speaking of Antiochus, it was speaking of the end times, where Dr. MacArthur said, yes, it's speaking of Antiochus, but it's also speaking of the end times and the Antichrist and the end of time. And then those original men that we talked about, John Gill, Calvin, Albert Barnes, they only looked at it as being representing the Jews, the Levites, and the priests that led Israel as being what he was talking about. So, differences, beloved, differences between godly men. Don't lose that. All right, let's look at verse 11 and 12 now. Yea, he, which is speaking of the little horn that came out of one of the 4, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now, notice it says, by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, speaking of Antiochus, okay? Now I want to read this in a different translation, in the English Standard Version. It, the little horn that came out of the 4, one of the 4, became great, even as great as the prince of the host. Now, King James says, even to the prince of the host. The English Standard Version says, even as great as the prince of the host. And then it goes on, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Now listen to the easy read version of this same 2 verses. That little horn became very strong, and it turned against God, the ruler of heaven's army. It stopped the daily sacrifices that were offered to the ruler, and the holy place where the people worshipped the ruler was pulled down. Because of this sin, the daily sacrifices were stopped. Truth was thrown down to the ground, and the little horn did these things and was very successful. Now, do you see, beloved, even how different translations can add to the confusion of end-time prophecies? I hope you see that. And depending on what translation you use, you can very well come up with a different view of end times. Okay? Some will say, well, King James only. And some will say, no, King James got too many things wrong with it. This is the best one. And another one will say, no, this is the best one. They argue back and forth, and there's always a new one. But I'm just saying all of this. God's Word is true, it's complete, and it's infallible. But understand, King James, English Standard Version, New American Standard, Easy Read Version, all of these are only translations from the original Greek and Hebrew. And depending on what manuscripts you use to translate from, you may come up with a few differences. So, and where it really tells is in end time events. So I want you to understand that, beloved, so that you'll grant people grace if they have a different view from you. Okay? All right, let's look at John Gill. He said, some interpret verse 12 as a garrison of soldiers placed by Antiochus through his sin and wickedness to hinder the oblation of the daily sacrifice. Others interpret it as a host of apostates among the Jews who advised Antiochus against the daily sacrifice and to kill swine and offer them on the altar. Now, some of the Maccabean writings in the Maccabees kind of tend to support that view. Some interpret the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression as this: because of the transgression against the daily sacrifice, because of the transgression of the priests or the people in neglecting the daily sacrifice, the host of the Jews were delivered up into the hands of Antiochus with the daily sacrifices for their sins. Now this is where Calvin inclines. He inclines to this sense, okay? And it cast down truth to the ground. That is, the little horn, Antiochus, or his host and army, did all that in them to abolish true religion and godliness. He cut in pieces the copies of the book of the law and burnt them, and he called the law of truth in Malachi 2:6, which was called the law of truth in Malachi 2:6, and he put to death the professors of the truth and showed all the contempt of true doctrine and worship that he was capable of. Now all of this was John Gill's quotation, okay? Now I want to read something for you out of 1 Maccabees chapter 1, and I'm going to read a portion of it because I want you to understand this Antiochus Epiphanies. This will give us a little actual historical what happened when Antiochus was in power, okay? I'm reading from 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 50, and then I'm going to jump down to 57 through 60. So just bear with me and listen to the history. It's very interesting, and it will really give you some insight into this one called Antiochus Epiphanies. Here we go. And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of the showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver, and the gold, and the precious vessels. Also he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Therefore there was a great mourning in Israel in every place where they were, so that the princes and elders mourned, the virgins and young men were made feeble, and the beauty of women was changed. Every bridegroom took up lamentation, and she that sat in the marriage chamber was in heaviness. The land also was moved for the inhabitants thereof, and all the house of Jacob was covered with confusion. And after 2 years fully expired, the king sent his chief collector of tribute unto the cities of Judah, who came unto Jerusalem with a great multitude. and spake peaceable words unto them. But all was deceit. For when they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. And when he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and walls thereof on every side. But the women and children took they captive, and possessed the cattle. Then builded they the city of David with a great and strong wall, and with mighty towers, and made it a stronghold for them. He's talking about Jerusalem there. And they put therein a sinful nation, wicked men, and fortified themselves therein. They stored it with armor and victuals, and when they had gathered together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, so they became a sore snare. For it was a place to lie in wait against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary to Israel. Thus they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary, and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them. Whereupon the city was made a habitation of strangers, and became strange to those that were born in her, and her own children left her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. As had been her glory, so was her dishonor increased, and her excellency was turned into mourning. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, that they should also leave their children uncircumcised, and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end, or for the purpose, that they might forget the law, and change their ordinances. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. And now I'm going to jump down and read 57 through verse 60, if you'll bear with me here. Okay. And whosoever was not found with any, who was found with any the book of the testament, or if any committed to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Thus did they by their authority unto the Israelites every month, to as many as were found in the cities. Now the 25th day of the month they did sacrifice upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God. At which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. That, my beloved friends, is Antiochus, or was Antiochus Epiphanies. Now, John MacArthur said, in addition to the desecration of the temple, Antiochus blasphemed Christ, to whom ultimately the host of Jewish people sacrifice, and to whom the sanctuary belongs. He, Christ, is later referred to as the Prince of Princes in verse 25. Now, Dr. Henry Morris, he says concerning the daily sacrifice, he says the statements of this passage could only be literally applied to Satan, who brought down many of the angelic stars with him when he magnified himself against God. Further, he will, through his possessed son, take away the daily sacrifice in the restored temple during the tribulation period. Dr. Morris uses the following verses to support this thesis: Daniel 9:27, Daniel 11:31, and Matthew 24:15. I'm not going to read those right now, but if you want to look them up, you'll see what he uses those three to try and support this view. We'll look closer at these scriptures when we get to them down the road, okay? But understand that in prophecy, often there is a near and a far fulfillment of prophecy that ties an Old Testament prophecy together with a New Testament fulfillment. Some examples are Isaiah 7:14 and Matthew 1:23, both concern a virgin giving birth. 2 Samuel 7:11 through 13 and Luke 1:32 through 33 concerning David's son Solomon being given a kingdom and building the physical temple, and Jesus, David's son, building the true temple of God, the church. And when Jesus was teaching his disciples about the end times, they asked him, when, notice when, will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? See, they're looking for the timing, right? That was Luke 21:7. And part of Jesus' answer was, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. And that's Luke 21:20 through 21. Now, some Bible scholars believe that this prophecy that we just read in Luke 21 was completely fulfilled in AD 70 when the Romans leveled Jerusalem. However, Jesus goes on to give additional details about this time. He says there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken at that time. Notice, at that time. They will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now that's Luke 21:25 through 27. It's clear by these additional details that the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy is yet to come. Some believe that all these prophecies occurred in the generation that existed at that time because of Luke 21:32 saying, where Jesus said, verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. However, others use this very same verse to say that this prophecy must be a near-far prophecy because Jesus said, till all be fulfilled. In other words, all these things must be fulfilled within one generation. This generation, all these things. In other words, in one generation, all these things will be filled. It's evident that some of it has never yet been fulfilled, such as the signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars, and upon the earth, distress of nations, the sea and the waves roaring, and men's heart failing them for fear, looking at the things that are coming on earth, and the powers of heaven being shaken, and the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Since these things have not happened yet, and Jesus said, till all be fulfilled, this generation could not refer to the generation existing at the time Jesus prophesied these things. And I'm going to stop there today to give you all that to think on and chew on. And that's a lot, beloved. Until next time, God bless. Amen.